So the first part is preparing for level of information need. So the prerequisites. If you know about the team here, we always talk about this concept of smart, lean BIM. And that's really how to make sure that you do the right BIM at the right time by the right people for the right reasons. And to prepare for that, we need to ask why. So why are we going to do BIM? What is the information needed for? What's the purpose? And being able to define that and describe it, being able to define when this is going to occur, so the milestones along the way, who is going to be requiring the information and delivering the information, and what the objects are or what the items are that are going to meet that set of goals. So when we talk about delivery milestones and purpose, we need to understand, is it going to be a design review? Is it a 3D coordination purpose? Is that the real reason why we're creating the model? Or is it a handover and maybe where less geometric representation is required and more data is required?
There's many examples. Many teams, design teams, will use anything from the schematic, design, seat, construction, document, review. So those are the reasons why they would acquire certain elements, documentation, which we'll get into a little bit more. But there are many different types of milestones that you can add from.
Yeah, absolutely. And combining them so that you understand what the delivery is going to be for and when it's going to be. Next part is understanding what is actually required. So within a breakdown structure, how are we going to break it down? We recommend that you use templates and having a structured classification structure, but also understanding here where we have different types of information inside of the same database related to the assets. Is it related to the responsibility matrix? And we'll show you how that helps us in creating very filtered and clear documentation later on. Breaking down by discipline, so understanding who is going to do what, and then using classification structures like Uniclass and Uniformat to be able to talk the same language and understand exactly what is required in that breakdown structure and where.
And make sure that there's a customer for those. So we always say keep it simple as possible. It's the clearest way that you can communicate across the team an organized list. If you need a classification, Uniclass, Uniformat, if it's mandated, then go that route. But the most common and simple is by discipline.
And make sure that you are looking in, you can see on the left side, scrolling, look into our templates, because we have a huge amount of, we keep on echoing the biggest ones, Uniclass, Uniformat, Masterclass, those, but we have some local great classifications as well. So most likely you will find what you are looking for.
Great point. Yeah, absolutely. And when you've got that classification structure, we need to identify specific objects. So inside of that, what are the objects and what are the element requirements inside of those? What are the detailed documentation requirements, planning requirements, understanding that list of objects, and it can be different for each use case. So it might be areas or massing for certain use cases. It might be documentation for other use cases. It might be a combination of all of these.
Yeah, it doesn't always have to be a modeled element. We see a lot of documentation requirements now being added within the app.
Yep. And then once we've defined the purpose, when it's going to be done, what that list of items are, who is going to be the person that is responsible for that? Whether it's somebody responsible for delivering it at a certain point in time, whether it's a team member on a team, being able to clearly define that and understand inside of the same place, even down to their contact details, so you can connect with that person inside of the same online environment, or pick up the phone and call them, organize a meeting if there is a handover potentially between one team and another team. Really critical to understand if the architect is responsible for some 2D representation early on for an estimate, but for MEP coordination, maybe the structural engineer is responsible for something later and in more detail.
So I hear validations of an example that I have about the architectural design most likely starts with the architect being responsible for many things. But then as the other designers come on board and engineers, so the structural designer, for example, would take over some of the responsibilities when it comes to slabs, for example, which in the end is going to result two slabs and the duplicate of the geometry, but not aligned from a coordination perspective, different slab edges, but duplicating quantities, for example, when it comes to quantity survey. So with this approach, you can very clearly communicate who is responsible for what in a given point in time and avoid those typical problems in the projects.
Absolutely. Yep. So now let's take a look at what level of information need is and how we are really describing what the requirements are in detail so that teams can understand them and automate the checking of those later. Level of information need is a new term that is being used to group these requirements in geometric information and documentation. But what is the definition? What are we really trying to do inside of these? The interesting thing is that it's developing. The level of information need framework has been published at a guidance level and not really in the detail maybe that's required to execute without eliminating the 20 years of planning that has happened in the past. So you will see more and more develop on this. You can even see here things like the accuracy and reliability that we'll unpack, which are additional requirements that you can define inside of Planoly to be able to understand exactly why and what you're going to be asking and carrying out on your project. Quick history lesson. So if you have been in the BIM space for a long time, you'll understand that there is a lot of confusion around LOD or LOD or LOD. Is it development? Is it definition? Is it detail? Is it a combination of all of those? And also, never to use this abbreviation of LOIN for level of information need, especially when you need to fit it on a slide there.
Never use it. Never use it.
Make sure. Never use it. This history lesson, try and keep it very brief, but the 5-number scale of 100 through 500 is not really that precise in defining exact requirements. However, it can point us in the right direction. So the new standards are actually saying, do not do away with all of that, but add all of these other pieces to the puzzle, make it easier to define and make it more precise to define what you're requiring. It enhances those concepts of LOD. And inside of the geometry, you'll actually find, based on the reference to the level of detail, the original LOD, that geometry, we do need to understand what the detail is of that geometric representation. The combination of these two things could be something that you want to think about. LOD is something that people are running with and can use on its own. The Planoly framework allows you to do that. You can also run the level of information need on its own and select that as your standard inside of the platform. You can also combine the two. So using that guidance and that direction that maybe might be ingrained in your teams, but complement it with the level of information need and understanding of the detailed requirements. If you'd like to look up more, there's a whole bunch of webinars that we have done in the past on this. But the principle is that we really need a clear and concise way of describing what is required. Okay, so the first part is the geometry. The first step inside of that is to understand the detail. So what is it that we're looking for? Is it symbolic representation? Is it generic representation? Is it maybe detailed representation? Or is it fabrication level? And understanding exactly what the element sets are and how much detail is required will obviously start to define how much time we will spend or how little time we will spend as we are developing these information.
But as you see on the image as well, so for different purposes that we started defining back in the EIR BEP phase, but also reflecting on it on our matrix. So defining what the purpose is, what the milestone is, it also define how you want to do the modeling, because for different purposes, of course, you will need different approaches to doing the modeling. And that's something that with the different detail levels, you can very well communicate to others.
Yeah, absolutely. And then the second part is dimensionality. So is this just a piece of text or a dot on a piece of paper, or is it actually three-dimensional? If it's 2D or 3D, is going to make a big difference in how much time is going to be spent creating it and updating it later on. And then location, where is this object? Is it relative to others? What is the definition for understanding where an object is, and is it associated with another object potentially? So is a window associated with a wall? Does it need to be 3 meters away from the corner of this wall? That type of representation could be required if you wanted to describe by location. And then appearance, understanding maybe from a rendering perspective, what the color, what the translucency, transparency, reflective, all of those perspectives of, is it just a symbolic representation that we don't need to render? Is it realistic representation that we really need to understand and almost have a lifelike representation so that people can understand it? The next one is parametric. See whether this is just an object that doesn't have any requirement for manipulation, or whether there are really detailed requirements for parametric behavior as well. We look at the accuracy and reliability as well, because even defining geometry, we're not able to just say this is a detailed representation in 3D with absolute position, realistic appearance, and no parametric behavior. We really need to understand, is that accurate and can I rely on it? And that's a whole history lesson there of the difference between level of detail and level of development. But in the interests of time, what we look at is this reliability scale, so that when we have the opportunity to say, if it's preliminary or whether it has been coordinated with others, there has been discussion, or it's actually an as-built. And at the as-built level, we are now able to say, this is the accuracy, whether it's measured accuracy or represented accuracy in the model, and understanding that if we define a requirement for a very, very detailed model as an as-built, at a very high level of accuracy, then it's going to take more time to create and it's going to be more money, more costly. But if we dial that down, we can expect to pay less and get the right BIM at the right time for the right reasons. Then we look at information and being able to identify the object within a breakdown structure. We talked about those breakdown structures, whether they are uniformat, uniclass, master format, all of these different types of breakdown structures, and understanding that they have potentially a coding system as well. Not only do we need to identify where this is, but also the information related to maybe a warranty detail. Maybe we need to know what the point of contact is if something goes wrong, or we need to barcode something in the physical world as well, so we can connect that some form of identification for that object in the model. And then the last one is documentation. We need to have a purpose for those as well. And that list of requirements needs to form part of the requirements. And this is something that we've done forever in a design, a list of items that we will be delivering at certain points in time. And let's bring that all together.
Let me give you a little break there.
I'll willingly hand over the reins.
Many teams have this challenge of trying to put all of this into a spreadsheet, and spreadsheets are limited in what they can do in regards to the visual nature of them, how much information. For every information, you've either got to make some great formula or you've got to add another column or row. Within the app, you build this and it's ready for you to just click away and assign. While you're answering all these questions that we just went through, you're making this container of requirements. So each one of these assignments that you've added is gathering all this information, and it's your one-stop shop to reference this information, to communicate. Here you'll see that you can have structured requirements, see who's responsible, commenting activities, seeing the history of when this was added, who's requiring it, all the way to even communicating questions and mentioning the direct person who asked for it. Great thing about having all of this information is that container is all together.
Yeah, absolutely. Yep. Information is great, but if it's not structured in a way that can be then checked later and make it easier for teams to collect the answers to all those questions, then it's really, really challenging. And as Louis said, the difference between using a spreadsheet or using a structured database for containing all these requirements is, I can see already in the chat there, somebody saying, Louis, brilliant. That's a game changer. Fantastic. That puts a smile on our face. We really try to make this a simple workflow. And I really, really appreciate wholeheartedly all the comments that we get. So how do we follow this in practice? We've looked at some of the examples from the standards, but let's look at how we apply this in practice.